Hi everyone, welcome back to the History Buff with your resident History Buff Artie and recurring History Buff Anna Morris.
Hi everyone.
So, and you're back with our series, The Tudors, A Real Game of Thrones. And we're now back with the fifth installment, which is about the break with Rome.
Yeah, it's really flying by, you know. 1 minute Henry Tudor's on the Battle of Bosworth and the next.
Yeah.
His son. Huge European shift, something that changes the face of history.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think, something that a lot of people forget is that it actually wasn't just England, that it was actually something that reverberated all around Europe. But yeah, so obviously, yeah, I mean, this episode we're going to be talking about an event which was pretty seismic. I would say that it was probably one of the most transformative periods in English history.
I compare it to modern day Brexit.
Very good. The
you
first
know,
Brexit.
I wrote an article on the similarities between the break with Rome and Brexit.
Where can the listeners or watchers find this article?
I'll link it below.
Ah, okay. So, guys.
I need more readers. I've got like 4.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, gay, basically. So, it led to the establishment of the Church of England, altering the religious, political, and social landscape of the nation, and then obviously, of course, set the stage for centuries of religious conflict and the eventual rise of Protestantism in England. And I mean, I guess the kind of root cause of it all was Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which he wanted to dissolve. So, I mean, obviously, they married in 1509, and Catherine was originally his brother Arthur's widow. But by the 1520s, the marriage was strained. I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot about this before, you know, the first 3 wives and the episode before that. But that marriage became strained because of the couple's failure to produce a male heir. And they only had one surviving child, Mary, but no male successor. So that obviously worried Henry about the future of the Tudor dynasty. And so, I mean, yeah, that is, I guess, what you could say was really the root cause of it all.
Yeah, so definitely the rise of Protestantism. So it definitely began prior to all of this. There were forerunners of the Protestant Reformation, Pierre Valdo in, I think, the 12th century, John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus, obviously William Tyndale as well. So William Tyndale was a very prominent influence, apparently, on Henry's... Influencer. Yeah. Big influencer.
Yeah, big Protestant influencer, yeah.
But, so there's obviously been like a school of thought always protesting, you know, the Roman Catholic Church, and there's definitely been waves of new thinking and definitely prominent figures throughout history who have mostly all been burnt at the stake. But before that, wrote at the time very, very controversial scripts or attacks on the church, because the Catholic Church at the time was arguably in pieces. Now, obviously, there's another school of thought that, the Catholic Reformation actually started before the Protestant Reformation. But at the time, it was hugely corrupt, which actually really affected someone called Martin Luther, who I think... Martin Luther. Martin Luther.
But just to give a bit of background, obviously, yeah, the Catholic Church is what dominated. Before that, Protestantism didn't exist. Catholicism was the dominant religion in Europe.
So actually calling it Protestantism at this time is actually too early. It was a evangelical school of thought, which later became Protestantism. And it's basically this idea that strips back a lot of catechism and, is based very much off the literal word of the Bible. So Martin Luther was a monk, and he had a particular problem with indulgences. Now, indulgences were, Martin Luther described them as cheapened grace rather than requiring grace by repentance. So basically, you could buy indulgences off priests to guarantee your way into heaven. So, you could...
Well, when you'd sinned.
So you'd say...
So if you're a rich merchant...
you could buy your way into heaven, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
So Martin Luther, actually quite devout Catholic, in fact, a monk.
Yeah.
He spoke against the indulgences, and there was a huge rise of indulgences because at the time, Pope Leo X was building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Obviously a hugely expensive project. So he actually encouraged the clergy to sell indulgences. They would be paid back to Rome, and he would fund the building of this beautiful basilica with that.
That's kind of crazy. Wow.
It's really crazy. And so Martin Luther pinned 95 theses, so 95, what's the word? Disagreements.
Yeah.
Mostly centered around indulgences, but he pinned it to the doors of the Schlosskirche, the castle church in Wittenberg, on October 31st, 1517. Now, in this, he also compared the Pope to the whore of Babylon. But other than that, I think his attacks were quite fair.
But I mean, do you know, he actually visited Rome in 1510, and he was very, and the reason why I think he was
appalled.
He was appalled, yeah. He was very disappointed by what he saw with all the corruption, and in fact, he was so appalled that he later wrote, "If there is a hell, then Rome is built over it."
Yeah.
Yeah, he called it a cesspit of sin. So
Sounds
that
great.
Obviously, well, I mean, it does. I know, yeah, it does.
Archie and I would love that.
But basically, yeah, well, because we basically live in Sin City anyway.
Yeah.
But so we would be very much at home. But yeah, so, he was appalled at the vice and debauchery he experienced, and not just among the laity, but also among the clergy, and even going as far as the Pope. And
exactly. So this is what's going on in Europe at the time. There is, Martin Luther is gaining a following. There's huge backlash against his 95 theses. One of them being Henry VIII, who wrote a defense of the Catholic Church, that even gave him the title Defender of the Faith. And Henry is hugely faithful, a devout Catholic. He heard Mass 3 times a day. He used to enjoy 3 things: hunting, being entertained by his jester, and reading theology is apparently what he loved to do. And this just being said kind of highlights the momentum of what's about to happen. So how do we see Henry going from defender of the faith, wind forward 10, 15 years? England is isolated, cut off from Rome. Henry's supreme ruler of the Church of England, and he has been excommunicated by the Pope.
And that's exactly what happened to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was accused of heresy because he was the one who, nailed these 95 theses to the wall of the church in Wittenberg. And because of that, there was lots of outrage in Rome, and he was actually excommunicated and, faced condemnation from the Catholic Church. But I think, unlike the people that you talked about beforehand, his ideas then really took hold, and they spread very quickly. But it was partly because of the printing press.
I was about to say the printing press, and also he later wrote in the vernacular. So this obviously made a part of the kind of evangelical way of thinking was that the Bible is, the truth, and the truth should be available to the layman.
Yeah.
And it was this idea of cutting out priests. Like, the priests have no authority. Your authority is straight to God. So then there obviously became the rise. I think it was Jan Hus. The reason he was excommunicated and burned was because he tried to get an English Bible circulating. He translated the Bible, which at the time was hugely blasphemous. So there were lots of kind of factors at the time, massively the printing press, because obviously they printed these 95 theses and distributed them all over the States, all over the Holy Roman Empire. And yeah, that definitely led to a huge following and a massive what's the word?
Yeah, I mean,
outbreak.
Outbreak. I mean, Protestantism began to take hold in, various parts of Europe, and it was crazy because up until that point, the authority of the Pope had gone unchecked, and now, the challenging of the Pope's authority and of just in general the Catholic doctrine.
Yep.
So it was essentially, questioning the natural order of things in a way. So it was a very unsettling time. And, in England, it all came from, the king's desire to get a divorce from his wife.
Yeah, so this is obviously what's really interesting, that obviously Henry had been granted papal dispensation in the first place from Pope Julius II. Now,
For when?
So he was granted to marry Catherine of Aragon because there is a chapter in Leviticus which says you can't marry your
brother's widow.
And there's a chapter in Deuteronomy that says you actually should. So Julius II said it was allowed. And then as Henry got, Catherine didn't have any sons, or as his son was taken, Henry, who was hugely religious, actually the day his son was born, he went on a long pilgrimage. Mm. So then he started to think, maybe I'm being punished because Julius II had no authority or was wrong to grant me something that is clearly not allowed. So he saw the lack of sons.
Thought God was punishing him.
God was punishing him because it was his right as a king to have a dynasty. And if you don't have a son, you're being punished by God, essentially.
Well, it was his job to secure that dynasty, and him, by not having a son, was not doing his main job.
Exactly.
By securing the dynasty.
Absolutely. And if you believe in the divine right of kings, then something is going wrong here. So he actually said he was being punished by God. The dispensation should never have been allowed. And Henry requested an annulment from the Pope at the time, Clement XII.
And whilst he was, kind of not so happy about the fact that he had no son from Catherine of Aragon, his eye fell on Anne Boleyn, who we talked about in the last episode, lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. So caught Henry's eye, and Henry fell madly in love with her, but she actually refused to become his mistress, insisting on marriage, which only intensified Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine.
So, yeah, obviously then he commissions his top guy, Thomas Wolsey, to start making inquiries into his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. So obviously he asks for an annulment, and this is really bad timing because actually it is not uncommon at this time for the Pope to annul a marriage. For example, Louis XII had his marriage annulled. Even Henry, and that was in 1498, even Henry's sister Margaret Tudor, the Dowager Queen of Scotland, had her marriage to the Earl of Angus annulled by Pope Clement the 2nd of March, 1527. So the year Henry asks for an annulment, his sister is granted an annulment. So he actually went to Rome. He sent his William Knight. He sent William Knight to Rome, and he is very confident because William Knight goes with 2 papal bulls looking for a signature. Now, the first one is cast away pretty quickly. This one asks for Henry to take Anne Boleyn as a second wife to keep Catherine of Aragon. But this idea is obviously falls through very quickly. Now, the second papal bull doesn't necessarily even ask for permission to marry Anne. It states that in the event that Henry's marriage to Catherine is invalid, he can marry a woman with whom he has an affinity. Now, interestingly, in his head, he has this confidence, I will get annulled, therefore I need to now ask for permission to marry a woman with whom I have affinity, and he had already slept with Anne Boleyn's sister. So he doesn't want, under canon law, this would class as incest. And he doesn't want to repeat. Obviously, he's looking to annul his marriage with Catherine because it is incest. So he's covering his base with his marriage to Anne Boleyn without even being allowed to marry Anne Boleyn yet. Because he's that confident he's going to get annulled. His annulment, sorry.
Now he's going to get annulled himself. Annul me. Annul me. Not Hermione. Not you. Me.
However, his timing really, really sucks because, like I said, his sister was granted an annulment March 1527. His representative William Knight arrives in September 1527. And unfortunately, on the 6th of May, there was something called the Sack of Rome. Now, this was where, so this is kind of the Papal States. There was a capture of Rome by mutinous troops of Charles V. Exactly. And these troops were made up of, mercenaries and
who's, by the way, the emperor of of the Holy Roman
Empire.
Who is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire?
Exactly.
Which is the most powerful state in Europe at the time.
Yeah, it's a huge, massive land. It stretched, like his control stretched from, the very western point of Spain across the whole of Europe. And his troops actually rebelled, and it resulted in the Pope being imprisoned. Now, Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon and obviously did not want to see his aunt subjected to such humiliation. He was not going to allow the Pope to grant a divorce.
Which she was, though. I have to say, I feel sorry for Catherine of Aragon. She had to endure a lot of humiliation when Henry was courting Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, but I also think, at the beginning, it wouldn't have been that deep. Because, he would have had...
So she would have looked at him and be like, it's okay, honey, it's not that deep.
Well, she probably thought she was just a mistress for a while.
And she was used to seeing him. She was used to seeing him with mistresses.
Of course, and Anne Boleyn's sister, and he's had babies with loads of other mistresses at this point. But
she probably just smiles and tends not to just looks the other way.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. But this is completely normal for men actually at that time.
At the time.
So, but no one would have thought it was taken this far. Remember, this guy just got Defender of the Faith title 7 years ago from the Pope. So now no one thought it would go this far. But yeah, so the Pope is imprisoned by Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and then begins a very long, slow slog. The Pope, who doesn't want to say, his hands are tied. He's trapped he's actually locked up in Rome, and he's then like, I'm going to send a papal legate to England. The papal legate is then, it takes him months to arrive, and the whole thing is this long, slow process now for 2 years stretches out back and forth. Catherine of Aragon gets, denies any claim. She whips out the original papal dispensation from Julius. Then it goes back to Rome. Then it stretches and stretches until you get to 1529.
Yeah, and by then it's already become the King's Great Matter. It's
called then the King's Great Matter, but no progress has been made.
Yeah.
So it's 2 years of
bugger all.
Yeah.
and it's in that year that it leads to the fall of Henry's chief minister, Thomas Wolsey.
Well, Henry gets really impatient with Wolsey. Wolsey hasn't been able to achieve
and the thing
anything.
But what's crazy about this is Thomas Wolsey had been such a good servant to him, and they had been good friends.
Yeah, they were obsessed with each other.
Yeah, no, but also Wolsey had been a really, really good chief minister.
Yeah,
very competent. He was very clever. He was very well. He was just very competent.
He was also the papal legate. He was the Pope's representative in England. So this is the thing. I think Henry kind of underestimated how difficult it would be getting this annulment, and I think a lot of it honestly does come down to the might of Charles V.
Well, no, and also Henry's passion for Anne Boleyn, because he would not have pushed it that far had he not wanted to marry her that badly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he at this point was, I think this is where I think Anne Boleyn then shoves the book of The Obedience of the Christian Man, by William Tyndale into Henry's lap. You see a shift in his mentality.
Exactly,
Over the 2 years, the bigger his frustration got at not being able it became very apparent that his influence is limited, that at the end of the day, he can't always get what he wants because of international influence. And he doesn't like the idea that his power is so limited.
Yes.
And that he can't do what he wants because at the end of the day,
he's meant to
they answer to Rome.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
At the end of the day, he answers to Rome.
But he thinks he should be the one that everyone answers to.
For sure. And that's where you start getting, where Thomas Wolsey ends up getting sacked, because at the end of the day, Thomas Wolsey is a cardinal. He's not kind of in the strictest sense. He's definitely not a moral man, if you look at his, what him and Henry used to get up to, but he's not the right, he wouldn't have come to that decision, we break with the church. He was not, as a cardinal, as papal legate, he was not radical enough. He was still a Catholic.
He was always sort of slightly saying, oh, are you sure you want to do that? Blah, 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 this, that, whatever.
It was more he was trying any means necessary to get around actually being like, no, we are breaking from the church.
Yeah.
And the idea for him to be excommunicated is, something he wouldn't even consider.
Yeah.
So it ends up for 2 years going round and round in circles.
You
have Catherine of Aragon, who writing to her nephew, you have absolutely denying any claims. Then you have these legates going across Europe, and then the Pope died, and then you have to start the whole process again.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, Thomas Wolsey, he failed to persuade the Pope. That led to his downfall, an actual arrest in 1529, but then he died in 1530 before he could be tried for treason. Wolsey was summoned back to London, but on his way back to London, he actually died. So, it's obvious that had he actually then got to London, he would have been tried and executed for treason. That's of course what was going to happen. So he was then succeeded as Lord Chancellor by someone called Thomas More, who was, this humanist lawyer. And he was actually initially supportive of Henry, but a bit like Wolsey, although I think Wolsey never voiced this, he was opposed to the break with Rome and Henry's marriage, and he was actually also opposed to Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, crucially.
So when Henry realised he wasn't getting anywhere with the annulment, he commissioned some very kind of humanist scholars at the University of Cambridge. Now, Cambridge University is historically more liberal and kind of a school of new thought, whereas Oxford is arguably more traditional. So the scholars at Cambridge included, Thomas More, Thomas Cranmer, and Thomas Cromwell. Now, it was More and Cranmer who actually managed to, they were theologians, and they managed to, from a theological point of view, build a case against Catherine of Aragon, against the lack of papal dispensation, basically arguing that Henry's marriage to Catherine was not true, should be annulled on theological reasons, going back to them finding the passage in Leviticus
20:21.
Exactly. And also, at the same time, Henry is investing in William Tyndale's Obedience of a Christian Man, which basically states that Christian rulers ought to govern themselves. This very much influenced Henry in declaring the Act of Supremacy, because, his Cambridge lawyers were then also arguing that England was more of an empire. And as someone who leads an empire, no external force on earth is above you.
Power over you.
Has power over you.
Exactly.
So if England is an empire and Christian rulers ought to govern themselves, then that technically plays on Henry's self-worth or arrogance, but also it really highlights to him that he is a king of an empire, and actually
he should be the supreme being.
He should be supreme being, but it also highlights him he always has been supreme being. That is actually wrong of him to have to report externally, or that anyone else on earth has influence over him and his realm.
Yes. And it's this that he tries to kind of get through to the Pope with Thomas More, but Thomas More refuses to acknowledge Henry as the supreme head of the English Church, which then led to his downfall and his execution in 1535. And so after him, he was replaced by Thomas Cromwell. So Thomas Cromwell was again a lawyer, came from, very humble background. He was the son of a
Blacksmith.
A blacksmith, yeah.
Son of blacksmith, yeah.
And he does actually manage to engineer the break with Rome by pushing the great matter through Parliament, because the thing about Cromwell is that he was elected a member of Parliament, and he then drafted the legislation that severed England's ties with Rome.
There is so much legislation. I think
Yes.
it starts in 1530 when there was appeal to scholars in university. The House of Commons drafts supplication against the ordinaries, and there was submission of the clergy, where the clergy basically had to... This is where Sir Thomas More resigned, when Henry basically... This decree issued that the clergy were all wrong to serve the Pope. And in the same submission, they also were granted pardon by Henry, saying, you have been serving the wrong
Person,
man,
entity. Yeah.
Your loyalties have been with Rome. However, if you sign this, you are admitting fault, and this way you will. This prevents execution or enforcement of any canons in England.
And basically, if you don't sign it, you're a traitor.
Exactly.
So, I have to say, the Thomas Cromwell was very clever, and he was one, who steers it all through Parliament. And
it's an incredible feat.
Incredible feat. He was a very skilled politician, and he, and thanks to his skill in shepherding this legislation through Parliament, he then establishes Henry, obviously, as the head of the Church of England. So how does he do this? As we mentioned, in multiple different acts. So Parliament was called in 1929 to specifically deal with Henry's so-called great matter, which is his divorce from Catherine of Aragon.
There's a very interesting, just on the point, there's a very interesting clause or document that he drafts up, which is the Act in Restraint of Appeals of 1533, which basically makes it illegal for someone to
appeal to the Pope,
take cases to Rome.
Yes.
Which means that when Catherine of Aragon appealed against what was happening to her to Charles V and the Pope, and when she went to Rome, what she was doing was technically illegal, because on English soil, it was from that point illegal for, to do that. So not only did it recognize England's national sovereignty, so i.e. England is an empire, it also removes, any kind of international influence, because you're not allowed to go overseas, you're not allowed to go to Rome. And this solves the problem of any kind of appeal against the divorce, because the only people you could appeal to who would say it's wrong is the Catholic Church. Exactly. And you're not allowed to go to them. Exactly. So the Act in the Restraint of Appeals for me in 1533 was the real turning point, because it backs everyone into a corner.
And it basically cut off the Pope's power in England, his legal power in England. But then I guess you could say the crowning piece of legislation was obviously the Act of Supremacy, which passed in 1534, and this declared Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, which solidified England's break with Rome. So, but you also had other acts as well. You had the Act of Succession, which required subjects to swear allegiance to Henry and Anne's offspring as legitimate heirs.
And Mary was declared a bastard.
Mary was declared a
Mary was declared a bastard. But there's a lot going on. There's also an act in the restraint of annats, which is interesting later when we kind of talk about the dissolution of the monasteries. It meant that any kind of benefice or any payment that would normally go to Rome, and there was a lot, because we spoke earlier about Martin Luther hated indulgences, and because every money that any church made across the world a cut of that went to Rome. Rome was so wealthy. If you had a priest just charging to listen to your sins, and think how many times people would go to confession or would ask for an indulgence or pay for a relative to get out of purgatory. That was a huge amount of money, and this forbids any kind of payment to go to Rome. So this is also a big part in later the dissolution of the monasteries.
And which basically comes about because by this point, Henry spent all of his money that his father painstakingly saved. His coffers are empty, And so Cromwell is searching around for things, for ways to fill up the state coffers. And, the thing is, the monasteries were very wealthy institutions. They had a lot of land, and their dissolution would provide Henry with much needed revenue. By destroying the monastery's physical presence, this would embolden Henry's position as the supreme head of the English church.
For sure. And also, it's along with the acts, Henry also could give the impression that the country was united in his decision to marry Anne Boleyn, because you couldn't speak anything bad about it. He also made a very ironic law that you can't call the king a tyrant, you can't wish the king death, you cannot call him, and there was like a series of names you can't call the king, which is quite ironic, like someone demanding that you can't call someone a tyrant. It's a very tyrannic thing to do. But it also gave the impression that, people were behind him, so he's like, doesn't have any opposition.
Yes.
Because you can't oppose him. And therefore there's, obviously a lot of, he marries Anne Boleyn. Oh yeah, we should probably say he then marries Anne Boleyn. Yeah,
in 1533.
1533. They actually had 3 weddings because it wasn't until 1534 that they could have a public wedding.
Because by that point, Henry was the supreme head of the church.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so that was like a public...
this is okay.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Started spending the night together in 1533.
Yes, exactly. But Cromwell was really the center of all of this. He was the one who oversaw the dissolution, which began in 1536, actually, when Anne Boleyn was executed, and continued until 1541. And the monasteries were systematically dismantled, and their wealth obviously then transferred to the crown. And, you had loads of kind of social and economic consequences from this. You had the redistribution of monastic lands to Henry's supporters. So people who supported him in becoming the supreme head of English church, they got, land, and he created a sort of new class of like landowners. But then you also have, the displacement of monks and nuns, many of whom were left destitute, and a lot of destruction of significant cultural and religious sites. And so there was a lot of consequences of this. And actually, a big consequence of it is the fact that it's how Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell, who used to be allies, is actually one of the reasons why they fell out.
Yeah.
Because Thomas Cromwell wanted to use the dissolution of the monasteries to fill Henry's coffers, whereas Anne Boleyn wanted to use the money from the dissolution of the monasteries to fund charitable endeavors and basically, use it for charity. And it was this disagreement, which was a big part of the reason that led to Anne Boleyn's downfall, because she got on the wrong side of Henry's chief minister. And I mean, I think by that point she was already kind of on the wrong side of Henry because she hadn't provided the male heir.
Yeah.
And so by getting on the wrong side of his chief minister, that meant that she was getting the wrong people against her.
And Cromwell was obviously hugely affluent. For me, the like MVP of this period is Thomas Cranmer,
who was
the
Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah.
Now, he was probably the most radical out of Henry VIII, out of Thomas Cromwell, out of Anne Boleyn.
By the way, I love how all of these people are called Thomas.
Yeah. It's
crazy. There's so many Thomases.
Thomas Cranmer, because he actually was, Henry did what he did, but Thomas Cranmer, I think, was like a real deep believer in the idea of a sovereign England that has power over its own church. He really pushed Protestantism as we know it in the reign then of Edward, because he did things that William Tyndale did, and bearing in mind William Tyndale didn't support the divorce of Henry and Catherine. Even though he wrote The Obedience of the Christian Man, he didn't support the divorce between Henry and Catherine. I know Thomas Cromwell actually went to Antwerp when Tyndale was arrested there and tried to get him off, but it didn't work. Cranmer is also a radical theologian, and he manages to pull through all sorts of very controversial things, which he kind of holds back a little bit in Henry VIII's reign. And then when Edward comes on the throne, he really pushes for, like I said, vernacular service, the Book of Common Prayer, kind of opening up religion to anyone. And this would have been absolutely banned at the time of Henry VIII because that was way too far for him.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, that's the thing really, is that at the end of the day, I mean, the break with Rome was a really seismic event. And, you know, it's what led to England becoming a Protestant nation, although Henry himself remained Catholic in doctrine. And, you know, it set in motion the English Reformation.
For sure. I think as well, it's an example of England.
Exceptionalism.
Exactly. Isolation as well.
Yeah.
It's an example of, you know, an early example of England setting itself really apart from mainland Europe. It's interesting, actually. There's a lot of crossovering of this idea of we don't want foreign influence. We don't. We are our own nation. We are our own empire, and we will do things the way that our sovereign wants it to be done, without any regard for any kind of external influence. And I think this definitely builds up over the next few years, over the next century, because we see the attitudes of kind of xenophobia creeping in. I mean, if you think about how normal it was for
back then, English people hated foreigners.
Well, no, English people loved Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish queen, because it was very normal for you to take a member of the royal family, of another royal family, and bring them to your country. If you wind forward, when Mary marries Philip of Spain, the fear of foreigners, the fear of external international influence in their empire is already really starting to creep in and heighten. So that's, I think, is also an interesting point. But yeah,
it is
so much going on in the space of 10 years.
No, exactly. Years. And the thing is that the break with Rome, it sets the stage for so much religious conflicts that would, you know, continue under Henry's successors, you know, especially under his daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I as well. But also then further on into then the Stuart dynasty.
James the First.
Yeah, because he was James the First. Because he was James the First of like England.
Yeah. James the Sixth of Scotland.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and then continues on into the Stuart dynasty, where Guy Fawkes, Catholic, tries to kill James the First by blowing up Parliament. Gunpowder plot. Probably going to do an episode about that at some point in the future. So yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot of effects from it. But also, you know, the break with Rome laid the foundation for the Church of England and the religious conflicts that would shape the nation for centuries.
Sure. And across, I mean, the whole of Europe was at war. The Holy Wars continued. And actually,
the 30 Years' War.
Charles V was running around his realms, defending the faith. But if you think about the Habsburgs, like all of their lands, they were then fighting left, right, and centre. And there was obviously in every state, there was definitely an uprising or some kind of, you know, feeling. There was a feeling of unease. And I think if you think about the Italian states, the Holy Roman Empire, the wars with France, then the rise of Calvinism in Switzerland, definitely a lot going on.
Yeah, and I mean, it is just kind of crazy that Henry initiated it all because he wanted to get a divorce.
So interestingly, there is a historian, J.J. Scarisbrick, and he said
it would have happened anyway.
It would have happened anyway because of Henry's growing frustration. There is one event that happens in 1515 where Henry is said to quote something, and I can't remember what, but he says something along the lines of, "Oh, the king, as a king, I have power and don't answer abroad," or something. I don't answer internationally. And J.J. Scarisbrick argues in his book, his biography of Henry, that actually Henry would have come to resent the church and
of his own accord.
Of his own accord. Now, I personally don't know if I agree with that, because it took 7 years, and I don't know how much he would have wanted to separate himself from the church if he would want to go through all of that. But
which puts a lot of onus on Anne Boleyn in that, if you think that.
Yeah.
Like he really must have been desperate to marry Anne Boleyn. And I think he was. I
Yeah.
think he was absolutely. I definitely think that Anne Boleyn was the wife that he was the most infatuated with.
Yeah, for sure.
Of all of his wives, she was the one that he was the most. But it's partly because she was very coquettish and very kind of like.
Yeah, she was definitely very sexy for her time.
No,
French
but
clothes. and
no,
her-
yeah, but as in she didn't sleep with him
No, yeah.
for the so and,
What was the
and
word you just used? Coquettish.
is that not what the word is?
I don't know. I've never had that word. It's a great word.
Coquettish. It is great.
Coquettish. That's a fantastic
Well,
word.
no, maybe not coquettish, but anyway, she was very. The thing about Anne Boleyn is that she obviously either knew what she wanted or knew what she was doing, because she refused to sleep with Henry, and this is, I think, what kind of drove him. And so, yeah, it's crazy, all of these power dynamics, and that's why we love the Tudor dynasty,
Yeah.
and why I think the Tudor dynasty is so popular, because of these power dynamics, because of sex, because of religion, politics, and all of this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And
it's all very kind of public in those days as well, because there's so many taboo topics that are coming in, and there's so much. I mean, from the corruption of the church to the lust of Henry to like the deaths of his ministers, like so much going on.
exactly, so much, and that's
High drama.
high drama, and that is why we're doing so many episodes for you guys.
It's hard to break it down.
Hard to break it down. But yeah, anyway, I mean, basically Henry would eventually die in 1547, but what's crucial, and I remember this, so this is one of the things I remember from school history the most clearly, is my history teacher saying Henry died a Catholic, just not a Roman Catholic. And
Wow.
that's the key thing, because I think a lot of people think that he died a Protestant,
Yeah.
but he didn't.
I mean, he then later, which we'll go into next episode, he then later kind of, I think he panicked a little bit
And
at
thought he'd gone too far.
how it was kind of escalating. And he actually then started passing laws that, reinstated certain bits of doctrine, because, he didn't want to lose that. For example, the idea of baptism and Holy Communion as sacraments. It took the scholars a long time to figure out how far we push this. Like, do we now start, if we are disputing, the authority of the clergy, that opens up Pandora's box of other things. Okay, if the clergy aren't there, then does that mean they have no right to distribute Holy Communion? Does that mean, it just goes on and on and on. So these were obviously topics that were debated long time after Henry was gone.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and so that kind of encapsulates it really, like the reverberations of
And it's still being debated.
yeah, exactly, and well, as you can see now, between these two very, very clever, very beautiful historians that you see in front of you now. So, initiated the English Reformation, which itself was initiated, basically, you could say, by Henry's desire for a male heir, because I think that was a big part of the reason why he wanted to then divorce Catherine and marry Anne.
If he's got a male heir, he wouldn't marry Anne Boleyn.
Yes, exactly. So that was the kind of we've talked about it. Like, this was the root cause of his 6 wives, of his and now we can say break with Rome. It was basically the root cause of basically everything that he's famous for. So yeah, and it profoundly altered the religious and political landscape of England, and with reverberations that we can still feel today.
Absolutely.
So crazy stuff.
Crazy stuff. A real life Game of Thrones.
A real life Game of Thrones. A real Game of Thrones. A real Game of Thrones.
Real Game of Thrones.
Cool. Okay, well, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, just see you next time.
Cool. Okay, well then, yeah. Thank you, guys. I hope you found that interesting.
A lot to digest. I think,
Also, we
after
still
that.
need to go to Wittenberg at some point.
We will. We're going to nail our own 95 thesis.
Yeah.
We're going to make our own new religion.
Yeah. And well, anyway, guys, I hope you found that enlightening. Thank you very much for listening and or watching. And we will see you next time when we talk about the last 3 wives of Henry VIII. So, see you next time.
Laters.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.